So the response from off-takers has been terrific. We'll be doing some formal announcements in the coming months, but just to give you a sense that we did an initial expression of interest, and that was significantly oversubscribed.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of APAC for Aurora. We're very much looking forward to today's discussion. We have Fraser Thompson in today. He's the co-founder and chief strategy officer for SunCable. He also founded an economic strategy consultancy called AlphaBeta, headquartered in Singapore, which has been acquired by Access Partnership. Prior to this, he spent 9 years at McKinsey, and in particular at McKinsey's Global Institute, which I always used to describe as McKinsey's top gun. Fraser, welcome to Energy Unplugged. We're delighted you can join us.
Thanks for having me, Hugo.
We're also joined by Weijie, Aurora's head of consulting in Australia, who's going to interview Fraser with me today.
Thanks, Hugo. Very excited for this opportunity.
Terrific. Fraser, everyone in Australia would be very familiar with the potentially immense SunCable project, batteries and solar in the Northern Territory to deliver power to Singapore. But for our EU and USA listeners, can you give us a rundown of the fundamentals of the project as they currently stand?
Sure, happy to. Perhaps before I go to that project, it's worth taking a moment to talk about SunCable more broadly. I co-founded SunCable with David Griffin and my brother, Mac Thompson, back in 2018. We've been pleased to have the support of our two anchor investors, which is Mike Cannon-Brooks's Grok Ventures and Dr. Andrew Forrester's Quadrant Energy.
For those overseas listeners, I think they're the two richest people in Australia, if not they're pretty close. Mike Cannon-Brooks founded Atlassian and Dr. Andrew Forrest, obviously, Fortescue. So two pretty heavyweight investors.
And we're very pleased to have them on board. And our mission at SunCable is actually quite simple. We take renewable electricity from where it's abundant and low cost to places where there's high demand, but there's low availability. And there's three sort of trends that go behind this, which are really important to understand. The first is that something that we know well in Australia is that we have abundant solar energy resource. And we have 58 million petajoules of solar energy falling on Australia every year. And not everyone will be familiar with what is a petajoule, but to put it in context, we only use 400 petajoules at the moment in Australia. And even if we had 100% of our primary energy needs served by solar, it's still 0.01% of that solar resource. So we could power the world 100 times over with this solar resource. The second point is that we're sitting on the doorstep in Australia, the most dynamic region in the world. We have 550 million people in Asia moving to cities by 2030. The consuming class is doubling, and plus we've got this global trend of electrification. And you put all that together, and you're seeing at least a doubling of energy demand by 2050, but potentially much, much higher. And then the final aspect of this, and this has been the missing piece in the why now, is that we now have had this evolution in high voltage direct current cable. And so these are the bits that we talk less about in the energy transition, but really important. Basically, it's the ability to transport electricity over long distances in a reliable and flexible manner. And that's been a combination of reasons, from voltage improvements that have been over at 10% per annum. So it's less transmission losses, more reliability because of better manufacturing and cable bearer risk assessment, and operational flexibility means that we can go into deeper waters. So that's if you like, the background context for SunCable. And our first project is this Australia-Asia Power Link. So it's the largest solar farm in the world. So it is 17 to 20 gigawatts in 12,000 hectares in the Northern Territory. So the solar site is about 800 kilometres south of Darwin. We also have a 36 to 42 gigawatt hour battery at the solar precinct, providing dispatchable electricity. From the solar site, we have an overhead transmission line that runs along the railway line corridor all the way into Darwin, where we'll be dropping off about 800 megawatts of capacity to supply Darwin's needs. And then the rest of it goes through a 4,200 kilometre undersea cable all the way to Singapore. And it'll supply roughly about 1.8 gigawatts of dispatchable electricity into Singapore.
Awesome. That's a great summation. I might hand it over to Mac in a second to get into the details of the project. But at the highest levels, like if you were, setting this as a McKinsey case study interview problem, can you kind of explain to our listeners how they should think through the economics of this project?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first, important to understand the building blocks of what drives the cost of these projects. The first is around land. So we have 12,000 hectares in the Northern Territory. And to those not familiar with the Australian context, Northern Territory is a vast amount of land. And we're using a tiny fraction of it, and an incredible solar resource. So we have, per square metre, we have 31% more electricity than you get anywhere near the equator, because you have less cloud cover. So you're starting off with this resource, which is abundant and high quality solar resource compared to local supply. The second thing that makes the economics work is around the scale. And so with the scale of each of these components, it allows us to completely rethink the way we design these systems. And a solar farm at around a 20 gigawatt solar farm is completely different from one in the hundreds of megawatts. You can do things with automation and a range of innovations which are not viable at that other smaller scale. And then the third bit is, as I mentioned, this kind of transmission technology improvement that now lowers the cost for going longer distance. So those are the building blocks which make make the economics work. It's interesting though, when we talk to off-takers, obviously the price is incredibly important, but the other things they care about is price volatility, right? And so particularly in the period we're in now, it's about removing that price volatility and offering 40-year PPAs. It's also about this interesting discussion at the moment. It's about being truly zero carbon. So not all renewable electricity is born equal, right? And even we're getting more awareness of things like hydro electricity. That hydro can be a terrific resource, but depending on how it's built, it could actually have significant biodiversity impacts. And so how do we think about really getting something which is not only zero carbon, but also biodiversity positive? And then finally, there's always the question of certainty of supply. So if you look recently, both Malaysia and Indonesia have decided to ban electricity exports to Singapore. And that's because they've got their own domestic needs that they have to satisfy, which is justifiable. Whereas Australia, as I mentioned earlier, is in a lucky position that we have more than enough to satisfy domestic needs. So it's that combination that often our off-takers, yes, price is a starting point, but it's that broader aspects of the volatility, the biodiversity impacts, and the certainty of supply that become really important.
Thanks, Fraser. And then you've touched on three really important points there, and we might circle back on that in a short while. You're obviously looking at very ambitious plans to export renewable power to Singapore, harnessing the petajoules of solar resources available in Australia, sending it through to Singapore. And then for listeners out there which might not be familiar, Singapore has only about 12 gigawatts of generation. So if you're looking at a 2 gigawatt project, you're looking at something like 20% of Singapore's total generation capacity potentially coming through SunCable. So what might be some of the key impacts on the Singapore market that you think might get kind of come out of this project itself?
Yeah, good question. So we're going to supply roughly about 15% of Singapore's energy mix by the time that we start supply. And the benefits for Singapore really come in a few different forms. The first one is obviously around carbon abatement. So Singapore has few local resources which are scalable for renewable electricity. There's limited tidal, there's limited wind, there's not the land mass for solar. So a lot of those opportunities that are available for other locations are not available for Singapore. So this will be a big help in helping that carbon abatement. And our project alone can meet Singapore's current abatement gap to meet their 2030 goals. The second is obviously around energy price volatility. Now, I referred to it earlier, but in Singapore, because of its dominance and reliance on the gas market internationally, now what happens in Ukraine and other distant lands has a huge impact on Singapore. So it's about also reducing the vulnerability that comes from that exposure. And the final bit, and this is what we often don't talk about a lot, but it's important, is an increasingly renewable electricity has been seen as a license to operate for companies that are coming in with FDI. And that's for many of our off-takers have had this discussion that they'll decide whether to build or invest if they can get the guaranteed renewable electricity. And we did a bit of a back of the envelope calculation that our project would enable roughly about 9.85 billion Singaporean dollars annually in economic impact from the FDI support it would bring in. So these are the kind of benefits that we see in the positive impact of the Singaporean market.
Thanks, Fraser. It seems like, there's obviously quite a bit of benefits that you and Weijie bringing to the Singapore market. And then a big part of this would, from what I gathered from your earlier kind of response was that a PPA would be something that you obviously be looking for to get this project going economically. How has the response from the Singapore side been then? Has it been pretty positive given how you might potentially help with the price volatility and then the security of supply issues that we're facing at the moment?
So the response from off-takers has been terrific. So we'll be doing some formal announcements in the coming months, but just to give you a sense that we did an initial expression of interest, and that was significantly oversubscribed from our available supply. So we knew that the demand was going to be there, but it's been proven by the active response to the expression of interest. On the government side, we're going through a formal RFP process, so there's limited things that I can say about that, but it's been a very productive relationship, and we've been engaging closely with the Singaporean government over the last 2 years. And it's also helped by the fact that Australia and Singapore at a government-to-government level have a very close engagement, and we've seen that recently with the Green Economy Agreement, which has been signed between the two countries. So that's an important part of it, is that we need to get the economics right, but we also need to get the governance structures and the politics right as well with any of these projects.
Just touching on politics then, I mean, what are still the major outstanding challenges to, final investment decision and delivery? Clearly it's a technically challenging project and there's that aspect, but what are the others?
Yes, look, the key things, when we think about these projects, you've got I sort of put them into sort of two categories. I put them into the technical, and I put the other ones into the political. In the technical side of things, we've got a great team of leading experts from Bechtel, Hatch, Savannah, Jurong, and Marsh, and we've got over 200 people who are supporting the over 100 people in SunCable developing this project. So that's terrific to have that. But there's a huge scope of activities there to design this optimized system. That we've had strong progress. The real key things that we focus on at the moment is securing access to critical inputs. And so these are particularly things around cable supply, but also around the supply chains when it comes to solar. There's increasing focus on geopolitical risks with the solar supply chain, increasing focus on slavery conditions in those supply chains as well. And all of this is important to get right and critical importance for us, but it makes it a much more complex task than it was, particularly when you're building at this scale. So we have a whole set of teams that are looking just at that procurement aspect to lock in the key inputs that we need. When it comes to the political side, we're obviously dealing with 4 jurisdictions when you include Northern Territory. So we have been lucky on the Australia end that we've received major project status by the Northern Territory and the Australian governments. It has been pleasing to see Australia's new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, publicly mention the project and the support for this. And practically speaking, the kind of legislation that's been passed through in the Northern Territory, our project development agreement and SunCable specific legislation is incredibly helpful for speeding the permitting and approvals process for everything we need there. So that's been great. On the Indonesia end, it's also been terrific. We've had strong support from early on from the Indonesian government. They gave us preliminary route approval that was announced back in September last year, and the subsea permits. And part of the incentive for Indonesia is very clear cut, is that even though we don't drop off electricity into Indonesia, we see Indonesia as a fantastic opportunity for sourcing many of our key components. And so we announced US dollars $2.6 billion of potential investment and spending over the lifetime of the project that we're looking to source from Indonesia. And so that's active focus for us, is to making that happen. Plus, we've signed 2 MOUs with Indonesian universities to help them on knowledge transfer to develop their own domestic grid. So that's a key bit. And obviously, Singapore is the final piece of the puzzle. We're going through the RFP process at the moment. And obviously, I can't say much about this, but it's been a very strong and close engagement over the past 2 years. So that's where we're at. It's always every week brings a new challenge, but both the technical aspects and the government aspects at the moment are definitely tracking to the levels that we hope they would be at this stage.
Yeah, so I think it seems like you're getting great support from the governments, not just from Australia, but the various international governments. What about the private sector? How has the response been from the private sector to date?
So look, it's been great. I think we would separate the private sector in a few different levels. So from a supplier standpoint, we're closely engaged with a range of different suppliers. Obviously, with the critical inputs like cable manufacturers, on the solar, the batteries, etc. So we've done a range of different sort of fact-finding tours to different operators around the world to understand what's happening with technological trends. How do we think about the right design for us? We've also put a strong focus with the Northern Territory routes, is to make sure that local and Indigenous companies have the best chance to benefit from that as well. So that's been positive. We're also a sponsor of the local football leagues in the Northern Territory. It's little bits, but it's things that we like to sort of show that we're not here just to develop a project. A lot of our people come from the Northern Territory, and we want to find a way to give back. So that's on that aspect. On the off-taker side, we've got 2 sets of off-takers, if you like. We've got off-takers in Darwin for that 800 megawatts I mentioned earlier. We will be making a formal announcement about that in the coming months. But what I can say is that there we are significantly oversubscribed from the amount that we can deliver. So that's for production of everything from green hydrogen to sustainable aviation fuels. So there'll be more mega scale projects that are going to be needed to supply that full demand. And then in the Singapore end, I mentioned earlier too that we've been oversubscribed in terms of our expressions of interest that we've received. So it's been a great response so far. Our next job is actually putting those into binding commitments and actually packaging that up for financial close for the project, which we're hoping to do towards the end of 2023, start of 2024.
Fraser, to slightly broaden it from the particular SunCable project, clearly your focus is on Singapore, but through your professional career, you've operated in a number of Southeast Asian markets. Are there any other Southeast Asian markets that you're particularly enthused about as destinations for private capital to drive the energy transition? I mean, Aurora is in the process of expanding into Japan, Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, Singapore, and 1 or 2 others. What's your list of best places to develop renewable projects and other components of the energy transition?
Yeah, look, I would say in short, all of the above are of interest to us. And the way I sort of think about it is I start off and look at where are we in terms of grid integration across Asia. And we did some research about a year ago, and we looked at some of the numbers in Europe versus where we are in Asia. Now, Europe has about 12% of electricity traded across borders at the moment, and aiming for 15% by 2030. And they'll probably more than meet that. Now, Europe is in different circumstances, given the political union, the close economic ties, the geographical proximity. But if you look here in Asia, it's 0.3% of the electricity that's traded across borders. So we're literally just at the start of this process. So it's the way we think about it is that we have to create a new industry here in Asia to develop this. And the benefits are large, right? If we did a thought experiment and said, look, could we meet Europe's target that they're aiming for in 2030, but do it 10 years later, so 2040? You then basically create an industry which is about $500 billion of traded electricity annually. You have roughly about 870,000 jobs. And from a carbon abatement standpoint, you can abate roughly 3x Japan's current emissions. So it's a real game changer when we look at the region. The next step is we sort of pick that apart and say, well, where do we start? So we started with Singapore because Singapore was a particular obvious choice in some ways because of its high demand for renewable electricity, strong governance, and also the limited domestic supply options. When you look at other regions, other countries across Asia, you actually have slightly different circumstances, but still really interesting opportunities. So, let me take Indonesia, for example. Now, Indonesia does have a huge amount of potential renewable electricity. The challenge is that they also have massive population density, 100x what we have in Australia. And that's part of the reason it's very hard for land permitting and all those challenges to get scalable projects up. And the hardest bit is that many of the provinces that have the highest demand for electricity in Indonesia are not the ones with the best renewable resource. So they're kind of like the problem that we're talking about at a global level, they've got it at a country level, but just within the islands. So that's another one where we get excited about saying, what's the role of HVDC to support that across just domestically? And then when we go forward, like we're excited across ASEAN. I think the ASEAN power grid is, people get a bit frustrated that it doesn't move quicker. I have a bit more sympathy. I feel a lot of these state-owned enterprises get saddled with jobs that are often outside their remit and do the best they can with the resources they face. But there's a number of opportunities just across ASEAN. And then when you get to India, the Indian government's been quite active in thinking about the Green Grid initiative and the One Sun, One Grid, One World concept. And they've got a number of ambitious projects planned, and one from India to Oman. So there's a number of projects that we're really interested in, and it's really kind of where do you start? And we've said, look, our starting point is this Australia-Singapore project before we look at these other ones.
Terrific. Let's maybe pivot to Australia then. So for our European listeners, Australia's been going through a pretty profound energy crisis over the last 6 months. In fact, our national electricity market was even suspended for a period of time due to very high prices, basically. Older coal plants are proving less reliable. Gas prices very volatile, Fraser, to your earlier point, but also flooding at certain coal mines, a whole pile of interrelated factors. And that sits on a bedrock, I suppose, of a decade of what's described in Australia of climate wars and very acrimonious political, but also increasingly market design debates as well. What do you think are some of the long-term impacts of the current crisis in Australia? And for, again, overseas listeners, we've just elected a new federal Labor government who are ramping up the ambition on decarbonisation as well.
Yeah, look, it's a painful time, right, in the Australian domestic context in the energy markets, and it's many of us have been scratching our head and going, how can we get to this situation where a country that's blessed with this incredible amount of renewable resource, we're in a situation where we're facing this kind of high prices and volatile prices. But as you referred to, Hugo, is that we know the key to the energy policy is that it's long term, and we have struggled in Australia over the last 10 to 15 years of actually putting together a coherent energy strategy. Now, hopefully, we are now seeing that period pass, and we're starting to see some really positive signals. I think the focus on transmission is a really important one. We often get tripped up with this question of saying, well, what's the cost benefit of transmission? And often we take a very narrow, rigid view of the benefits of transmission. And we miss out some of the biggest opportunities that it creates, downstream opportunities that suddenly can be created, the mitigation of the volatility of prices, etc. So I think there's a lot to be excited about. Look, if I had my own wish list of what I'd like to see in the government policy, there's a couple of things that I'd point to. One is that I think the AEMO is doing a terrific job in managing the grid and building a much more developed and advanced grid. I still think the scale of ambition is far too low for what we're going to need. When I look at the current plans, I look at a system that is basically business as usual. That'll look at some of the shifting demand we'll see amongst households for renewable electricity, but it doesn't cater for the huge export opportunity that we're going to see for various green products. So we're going to need not just one NEM, we're going to need multiple NEMs to actually get the scale of opportunity that Australia has. The second piece of that is that we should be working a lot harder on some of the downstream opportunities. And I'll give you one example is sustainable aviation fuels. It's a tremendous opportunity for Australia, given our great renewable resource. We also have one of the world's leading airlines here. But one of the missing links has been around government policy and the ambition level. The US and the UK have been really ambitious and at the forefront of a lot of a sustainable aviation policy, creating the right kind of supply side and demand side incentive to grow this. And this is something that we really could kickstart. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be the world leaders in sustainable aviation fuel if we get this right.
Just to pick up on something there, and long-time listeners of this podcast will be sick of me banging on about this issue, but I do very much agree with you in terms of the way we think about transmission. Now, I'm an energy market modeler and look at the world through that prism, but I think even the modeling we do in Australia around what's called the RIT-T process, essentially the cost-benefit analysis of transmission, is generally quite poor and just very narrow. So, even in a technical modeling sense, I don't think we're thinking hard enough about, for example, multiple weather years, commodity price volatility, stochastic outages of coal plants, outages of interconnectors elsewhere in the system, all of which have driven massive volatility in Australia's electricity market, flowed through into customer bills, but also, made in some ways Australia quite a challenging place to invest because of that volatility. So I think there's a lot more there we could do on the transmission side. And certainly Chris Bowen, Australian Energy Minister, has talked about that. The New South Wales and Victorian governments are pivoting to actually change the cost benefit tests for transmission. But it is a bit of a theme as well. I operate in California now, and it's the same kind of set of complaints around cost benefit of transmission. And I don't think anyone's really cracked the nut. And look, consumer organizations do push back. If we're going to build this stuff, we've got to be confident it delivers benefits. But I think, as you say, it's thinking more holistically and systemically about the benefits rather than the quite narrow way we come at it at the moment. Yeah,
look, I completely agree. It's my sort of pet topic too, of both sort of love talking about it, but get frustrated as when I talk about it as well. But when I think about it in the most simplistic terms, from an Australian standpoint, that we have, we're a continent, and that gives challenges, but also gives great opportunities when we think about shifting time patterns of demand and the shifting supply profiles that we can take advantage of. And if you look at our grid today, it's a very vertical grid. We're very heavy on the East Coast and runs north to south. There's very limited east-west, which doesn't make sense to me from a few different levels. One is that you get lower cost land and often better resources further inland, and secondly, you also benefit from that time shifting we talked about earlier. So I feel like that this is not to bag EMO. I think they've done some good technical analysis. We've pushed forward the agenda significantly. I think it more speaks to a more national discussion that we need to raise the ambition level of kind of where do we want to go, and then what do we need to do from a grid to actually support that?
Yeah, no, totally agree. Fraser, if we could pivot a little bit and talk about your career now from a couple of different perspectives, and Mac will take the second one. You were at McKinsey and BCG, and McKinsey for quite a long period of time. I think I was at McKinsey for a shorter period of time, but we always described it as dog years, basically. And in some ways, both of those institutions have done a relatively good job about, building a mystique and a reputation, although, McKinsey's been in the headlines recently for some of the wrong reasons. What do you think were one or two things that you took away from those institutions that have been genuinely helpful for you in the long run?
I had a wonderful time at both of them. I was only at BCG briefly before between my undergraduate studies and graduate studies, but enjoyed that experience a lot. And then it was at McKinsey, was meant to be for 2 years, like many people, and then ended up being 9 years. And that was across the Middle East, London and Singapore. And I think, I get disappointed seeing that the current troubles that McKinsey has faced with with some of these transgressions that are going on. But for me, it's an institution that's actually quite strong in its values focus. And that I think is it's incredibly important that I think a lot of alumni take forward into the different careers. The other thing that I really took away from it was that we often spend a lot of time at McKinsey in particular looking at the mega trends, looking at urbanization, sustainability, growth of consuming class. And often the most interesting opportunities come at the intersection of 2 or 3 of those trends. And when I think about SunCable, one of the things that got me excited when we were founding the company was that I saw the trend around the growth of consuming class and what that would mean in terms of demand for energy. And we all know that hockey stick that we see as you start to get people entering the consuming class in terms of demand. You then see the urbanization trend, which is shifting to certain key centers of demand, but also reducing some of the available land that would otherwise be used for local renewables. And then, of course, this trend around sustainability and shifting from being a nice to have to a license to operate. And that for me is one of the things I've really been thankful for, is the learning to interrogate some of those trends and understand exactly what do they mean.
Thanks, Fraser. And maybe to kind of ask a little bit more about your academic kind of years in Oxford, and then your decision to kind of move out into industry. So you did a couple of years in Oxford with a PhD and master's in economics, as I understand. And you quite quickly, as you mentioned, came out to BCG and then to the World Bank and then McKinsey, amongst others. And we do actually have quite a few, of our analysts that have kind of came through a PhD route that have joined us. Would you typically recommend a PhD to people who are not actually, interested in a long-term career in academia? Were there any kind of key bits of your PhD that you really took away that helped with your professional career to date?
For me, people come to these with different motivations, and for me personally, I never wanted to go into academia, but the drive to do a PhD I was really fascinated by public policy and wanting to have a toolkit to actually interrogate some of these key issues and go as deep as you need. And that's been incredibly useful. And just, Hugo, the discussion we just had around transmission lines and the cost benefits, it's very easy to get the received wisdom and say, oh, this doesn't make sense. But being able to really dive deep into that, tear it apart and say, what is that really underpinned by? And is that assumption really credible? And what if? This I found became, for me, a terrific benefit. So I guess I'd say that you don't have to just want to go into academia and do a PhD. And I strongly encourage people who are interested to do it. I'd say the caveat is that apart from making sure you get a good supervisor, and not the typical supervisor who you come into their room and they say, "What's your name again?" You say, "I'm the guy that's been but I think also making sure that you've really got a passion for it, because it is the cliche. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think unless you've got that passion for the subject, it often isn't a great trade-off. But I loved it, and I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have had that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? John Feddersen, who you know well, another BCG Rhodes Scholar into the PhD program at Oxford Economics. He and I have this back and forth because I'm a little bit more skeptical of the values of PhDs, and I think there's a lot of talent that goes in because it's the next carrot in front of the nose of smart people, but they get to the end of it. And then they're like, well, I don't want to go into academia, and they've kind of taken 4 years, admittedly at a glorious institution like Oxford, and there's worse ways to spend your time than that. And then go to what they would have done anyway after a master's without necessarily contributing enormously to the body of human knowledge. And so I wonder if there's a redesign coming of the way we think about graduate studies, and because I think we do burn a lot of talent, and apparently it's an NPV negative decision on average for people, because they chew up 4 years at the front of their career and don't necessarily earn it back later. And that shouldn't be the basis for all decisions, right? I hope there's still people out there writing PhDs about Hamlet in 50 years, and that's never going to be an NPV positive decision. But yeah, Fedo and I have this back and forth, and often we're a bit misaligned.
It's a good debate to have, right? And I do think when these academic credentials become like an arms race, I'll just say that it's the next big thing. And I got, that I remember when I started at McKinsey, one thing I found a little bit frustrating was that there was this just emphasis on that all business analysts would then go and do an MBA. And often wonder like why. So I think MBAs are great. I never did one, but I can imagine they're great for certain people. But I don't think it should be a requirement for everyone. And McKinsey did evolve that and change the different pathways for promotion. But I think when it becomes a credentials arm race, then we are in an NPV negative territory very quickly.
Fraser, one final question then, and I ask this to all our guests, and we get some great responses. Who do you read or listen to in the energy space that you think is always good, thought-provoking, and relevant to your work in the private sector?
And you mean, obviously, in addition to this podcast?
Yes, other than Energy Unplugged, obviously.
Yes. So I listen to a bit of an eclectic mix of podcasts, and this won't resonate with people outside Australia, but I'm an Essendon supporter for Australian rules football. So I've stopped listening to football podcasts because they just depress me. So I look for others. So look, I spend a lot of time listening to different podcasts and for a variety of different sources, not just in the energy sector, because I think it's always interesting to look at what are trends happening in parallel sectors and how does that have implications for the energy sector. But when the energy space, in Australia, I like to listen to Energy Insiders podcast. It's always interesting to see what's coming on and locally. The Redefining Energy podcast I've been listening to a lot lately, and I found some of the really interesting episodes about what's happening with battery technology, and it's fascinating to see some of the latest developments and the excitement versus the reality of some of these technologies. So those are a couple that I'd point to.
No, terrific.
I'd love to hear more suggestions. So if you've got a good list for me, please send it my way.
Thanks a lot for your time today, Fraser. We have obviously covered a huge amount in 40 minutes, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would have learned a lot just about, the SunCable project has always been a very fascinating project given the size and the scope that it is aiming to do. And you're running one of the most busy organizations in the Australian energy space. So we are very, very appreciative of your time that you've taken to spend with us and our listeners today. So we do wish you all the best, and thanks again for all your time and contribution towards our podcast.
Thanks, Mac. Thanks, Hugo, for having me.
That was Hugo Batten, Aurora's Managing Director for APAC, talking to Fraser Thompson, SunCable's co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer, and Weijie Mac, Aurora's Head of Consulting in Australia. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.